Inscriptions on tombstones, when interpreted, provide background information for fascinating analyses of societies, not just in aspects of how we celebrate the dead or the rituals we use for death, but in a broader and more comprehensive way. They provide collective perspectives on worldviews at given points in time, and they reflect the cultural aspects of the people who created these monuments or mementos. Of course, there is the obvious point that people immediately understand, such as genealogies, but far beyond this, they provide us with an intellectual discourse of the way previous societies have seen the world in which they lived, how they related to that broader view, and how this was played out.
O death, where is thy sting, O death? Where is thy sting?
Where is thy victory?
O grave, where is thy victory? O grave,
O death, where is thy sting? Where is thy sting?
O grave,
Where is thy victory?
Hello and welcome to Tales from the Tombs. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. In our last program, we looked at the architecture of the church and we interpreted the inscriptions found on the ledgers and memorial plaques to be found inside of the church. In this week's program, we shall take you as close as possible to the tombs, for we're about to reveal their many tales. We begin first of all with Senator Professor Henry Fraser, who comments on an interesting piece of flora to be found at the entrance of the graveyard.
We're now about to enter the churchyard or the graveyard of the St. John's Parish Church. This is one of the most wonderful places in Barbados. And I noticed that as we pass the old coral stone gate post, that there's some beautiful violet-colored pentas flowers growing out at the top of the gate post. And that's beautiful because we're looking across the Atlantic to Africa, and the pentas, of course, is a flowering plant that comes from Africa.
A leisurely walk through this graveyard is like taking steps back in time. As you enter, you will see some of the ancient 17th century tombstones.
In the old days, it was traditional for a family which could afford a tomb like this to build what was virtually a miniature house. And you enter the tomb down some steps. There's usually an arched door, and you see a series of these tombs with the arched entrances, long sealed up because most of them haven't been used recently. But this is the tomb of the Mayers family, and the Mayers family are ancestors of mine on my father's side. It was thought that they were Jewish Mayers who converted the name to Mayers when they became Christianized. And looking over the cliff down towards the sea, just behind the big family tomb is a smaller tomb of my paternal great-grandfather, Samuel Mayers, patriarch of the Mayers family.
As you walk further into the graveyard, you will come to what could be easily described as a lovely planted grave.
A very prominent, well-known Barbadian buried here.
Iris Banachie, well known in the field of horticulture, and Andromeda Gardens in
Yes, Andromeda Gardens was her creation.
I've known this place since I was a small child, and it had belonged to my mother's family for nearly 300 years. It was used, parts of it, for agricultural purposes, but as you know, it's on a steep slope, and there are great, huge boulders of rock, which make it difficult, really, for modern farming, except in certain small flat areas. The history of this property probably goes back a long, long time before Barbados was settled, because in digging the foundations to the house, and often when I'm planting trees and getting a deep hole, I can come across Arawak artifacts, that is their chisels and their tools, which means with a little stream that meanders throughout this property from the top to the bottom, we find that there must have been Arawak people who lived on this property.
Where is thy
was actually born in Maconie and then married an equally famous Barbadian doctor, Harry Bailey.
Harry Bailey Observatory.
The Harry Bailey Observatory, yes, he was very keen on astronomy.
Iris Branch Banachie, of course, was the widow of the famous Dr. Harry Bailey, the founder of the Diagnostic Clinic in Barbados. She herself ran his magnificent laboratory, probably the most modern laboratory in the CARICOM countries in the 1950s.
But Dr. Bailey was also very prominent in medical research, and I think one area that he particularly researched was leptospirosis, the transmission of leptospirosis by rats.
And when Dr. Bailey died at the age of 50, she subsequently married a Scottish teacher called John Banachie, and she founded Andromeda Gardens in the 1950s, and she died at the age of 75 and is buried here in this beautiful tomb planted with the famous croton palm trees and so on. So it's one of the best kept horticultural specimens of the graveyard of St. John's.
But Iris Banachie, in her own right, she was very interested in alternative medicine, and she studied, for example, bush teas.
Is her findings still available?
Yes, it's available in the Journal of the Barbados Museum. Are you a great one for bush teas, Ruben?
Well, I grew up on bush tea with my great-grandmother. I mean, Circe bush for cold, Christmas bush. I had some clamashary leaf tea, pear leaf tea, soursop leaf tea. There was something called fever few, I think it was. All of these.
Well, you've got a whole gamut. I only had Circe bush tea. Well, you seem to have had quite a lot, yes. Yeah. So, Iris Maconie Banachie, great contributor to Barbados' horticultural history, a great patron of the Barbados National Trust. When she died, she bequeathed Andromeda to the Barbados National Trust, which is again one of the major linchpins in our heritage and ecotourism offerings. And yes, so a contributor in many points of view. I speaks up to correction, worked with the
She was chairman
of the
National Conservation Commission, so she would have been involved in the preservation of the environment, protection of the environment, preservation of the heritage of Barbados.
Yeah, very, very important contribution.
Now, if there are two churches in Barbados that are the epitome of the burial ground of the planter class, those two churches would have to be St. George and St. John. I'm
standing under one of the typical trees which decorate the graveyards of Barbados, frangipani, and I'm standing here by the headstone of a very famous individual, Ferdinando Paleologos. Paleologos migrated to Barbados just as the sugar revolution was starting, in the middle of the 17th century.
First of all, he's the son of Theodoro Paleologos, an Italian. They migrated from Greece after Constantine and the Byzantine Empire fell to the Turks. The Greeks went westward, stopping in Italy, then migrating to England. Ferdinando's mother was a Ball from Suffolk in England, and then migrated to Barbados.
He lived in this parish. He was the vestryman of the parish, plantation owner, and he claimed descent from the last Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. Rome, as we know, divided into a western section and an eastern section. And the line of emperors from whom he claims descent resided at Constantinople, which is today Istanbul.
Well, he was buried in the vaults of Sir Peter Collyton, a member of the Collyton family of St. Peter and St. John, and so important in the history of the settlement of the Carolinas.
When the church was being repaired, they discovered a coffin under the organ loft. And this included a very large coffin with an individual of a large size, buried in quicklime, and the coffin was taken out and moved and deposited in this vault. This headstone then was put up many hundred years after Paleologus died. The date on it is slightly in error. He actually died in 1670.
Now he was the owner of Ashford Plantation, which is 2 miles as the crow flies south of here.
There is a story, I don't know how well substantiated it is. Greece used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, and in the 19th century, when Greece fought and gained its independence, they were seeking a member of the old imperial line of the Holy Roman Empire to rule Greece. So apparently they sent out to Barbados emissaries to find out whether Paleologus had left any direct descendants, because they were going to offer him the throne of Greece. Well, there were no confirmed direct descendants of Paleologus here on the island, so instead the throne of Greece went to European royal family from Scandinavia, and the present-day Duke of Edinburgh, of course, is a descendant from that line of European royalty, which then ruled Greece until relatively recent times.
This, of course, has been written about, and every ancient visitor, 100 and something years, heard about Paleologus, and this was almost a mecca for people looking for the historic side of Barbados. Everyone would come to St. John's Church. When I was a small boy living in St. John, every time a cruise ship came in, then dozens of the large taxis would sweep up to St. John for the visitors to take their photographs of this famous monument.
And so we leave the headstone of Ferdinando Paleologus and reveal more interesting tales, taking note of the funerary architecture to be found here in the yard of the Church of St. John. Speaking of interesting funerary architecture, here's a story of a member of the Seeley family whose last peculiar wish was granted. It must be noted here that, contrary to popular belief, he was not a seaman, neither a sea captain. In fact, he was a member of the wealthy Seeley planter family here in St. John.
And this particular grave is, as I said, an interesting and unusual one, because prior to his death, Thomas Seeley requested that he be buried standing up and with his face looking towards the Atlantic Ocean.
We always like taking people down here and trying to establish how he would be. See? You anchor him, his feet down inside, and his head just comes there. All right? And that is a novel way of burying them. I don't think we've seen it in any other parish cemetery in Barbados.
So this is how he went into eternity, standing, looking towards the Atlantic. An interesting way of resting and preparing to meet your Maker.
One aspect of funerary architecture, symbolism, and the examination of graveyards is the light it throws on societal differences and aspects of social history that can be derived from a study of graveyards and tombstones.
Here's a lovely example on the cliff overlooking the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. One can imagine between here and, if you stretch your imagination, Africa lies some 6,000 miles across the Atlantic.
And I always tell people that when you look at the Atlantic, the only land beyond that horizon is Africa. And they don't believe it. But we are the most easterly of the Caribbean islands, and we are exactly opposite to Dakar, Senegal. And it is no wonder that the slave ships made their first landing at Barbados.
And here's an example of the point I was making about social differences making their point or making their mark even in death. Some families here constructed these large elaborate vaults, such as this one, which is occupied by members of the Carter and Kerr family. Large elaborate mausoleums or vaults where the dead were deposited. Then over time you had simpler areas where where the dead resided, flat ledgers as opposed to the elaborate mausoleums that house the dead. But irrespective of that, one of the things that I pointed out was that St. John represents the peak of the power of the plantocracy in the 18th, 19th and 20th century. And perhaps no one planter family was more prominent in St. John in the 19th and 20th century than the Haynes family. The Haynes family owned several plantations, including Newcastle and Clifton Hall. They owned perhaps half of St. John or more, and their properties extended elsewhere as well.
The Honourable Richard Haynes was a member of the Legislative Council, and he lived at Easy Hall Plantation. What a lovely name. Now, Easy Hall was on the border of St. Joseph and St. John, and you will note that in St. John we have wonderful names for our plantations, places like Industry, for example, and Venture, whereas over across the border in St. Joseph there was the name of a plantation called Easy Hall, as if life was a lot easier in St. Joseph, maybe because the soil was more fertile and it was richer soil. Next to the Honourable Richard Haynes was his sister Mary Howell Haynes of Newcastle, and she died in 1957 at the age of 97. She was the last descendant of General Robert Haynes of Newcastle to live in the Newcastle Great House, which, as most people know, is now encased in forest. It had been purchased by the government to become a children's home, and it was subsequently abandoned, allowed to be overtaken by forest. Offers to buy it were never acknowledged, and that is now one of the most famous ruins of Barbados. But Mary Haynes was a lovely old lady living to 97, and Richard Haynes next to her was a very interesting man, because over here on this side of the path are the tombs of two sisters, the Seeley sisters. Isabel Seeley and Polly Seeley lived together with Mr. Haynes at Easy Hall.
And the most outstanding of them all, Emily Lyle Haynes, born at Guinea Plantation. One of the Haynes' plantations in St. John. There's Guinea, Bath Plantation, there's Newcastle, Clifton Hall, Wakefield. You have Bissecks in St. Joseph and Golden Ridge in St. George. Right? Emily was born in 1861 and died in 1965 at age 104. And at the time she died, she was the oldest person living in Barbados at 104.
So again, a reflection of the fact that the powerful in life made a transition, and that power that they exercised in life continued to manifest itself in death with the types of monuments and the houses that were erected to house their dead. So that in this respect, a churchyard is a reflection of the divisions in society. And one can say that the closer one is buried to the church, or if one is buried inside the church, this represented the peak of upper class aspirations. And then you could draw concentric circles, and as the circles expanded out and moved further away from the church, then you went down in the class structure, and on the very perimeter, or the outward boundary of the church land, is where the very poor and the powerless were buried. So again, death mimicking the social divisions of life. We're here by the tomb of a well-known individual who made a great contribution to museum studies and archaeology in its nascent stage. This is the Taylor Vault, and Ronald Taylor is buried here. The Taylor family, well known both in St. John but primarily in St. Philip. And I know that you are a Philippian, yes, and you probably know more about the Taylors than I do.
Well, actually, I met Mr. Taylor when I was a student at Foundation, through my history teacher, Mr. Ronnie Hughes. At the time, I had an interest in caves, and we used to explore Oliver's Cave, which was just off Ocean City. And Mr. Hughes and Mr. Taylor came one weekend, a Saturday, and we toured Oliver's Cave. Oliver's Cave, there were writings on the wall, and there was something like a chair that was carved out of the rock. So I guess because of that, as a museum specialist, Mr. Taylor had an interest, and he was brought along by Mr. Hughes.
Yes, as I said, he did a lot of early archaeology in Barbados. I know he excavated with the Bullen Couple, Chancery Lane, and he actually, one of his major publications was a compilation of all the work, all the articles ever written on the archaeology of Barbados. And he was also very knowledgeable about antiques. And a lot of people don't realize that he was also a good painter.
I understand he painted a picture of Sir Grantley Adams.
Yes, he painted a very well done oil of Sir Grantley Adams. I published it in the journal, in the museum, a photograph of the painting. I am not sure where that painting hangs today, but as I said, I've seen photographs of it, and it was very well done. I think it was painted in London, painted at the home of a Mr. Carrington, a Barbadian resident in London, yes.
The Taylors were a more recent addition to the planter family of Barbados, St. John rather, and as a matter of fact, their own Golden Ridge, they were at Wakefield, etc.
His mother, her tablet is in the middle, Muriel Taylor, and she was described as a young woman as the most beautiful woman in Barbados. Here, bottom right, is the tomb of Henry Vernon Taylor, another very interesting man dying in 1965, and he is described here as Henry Vernon Taylor of Hobbesall. It was his intention to become a priest, but his father became ill and he was brought back to manage the Hobbesall plantation, and he didn't particularly enjoy that.
And so we've come to the end of yet another interesting program of Tales from the Tombs. This week's tales came from the tombs to be found here in the yard of the Church of St. John. Until next time, I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Goodbye.